Welcome back. This video examines the dishonest misinformation regarding sea level rise. Disturbingly, the UN members of the COP26 Climate Conference, America's Department of Defense, National Public Radio, and mainstream media have all been intensifying sea level rise fear-mongering to amplify the COP26 climate crisis agenda. Just a small example of fear-mongering, we see graphics portraying a flaming Earth with red ocean. As expected, media outlets like CNN have been busy generating computer fantasies of flooded cultural icons. The Grist warns that California's coastline will be inundated by 10 feet of sea level rise by 2100. California's powerful Coastal Commission just released another requirement demanding any adaptation actions must plan for 3.5 feet of rise over the next 30 years. I served on the City of Pacifica's Sea Level Rise Community Working Group, and such dishonest, fearful predictions by the Commission, disguised as the best available science, only divided our city, with many people so overcome with blind panic they argued we'd abandon the coast, abandon coastal homes and businesses, and rip up infrastructure and move it inland now. Just recently, the Coastal Commission denied a beachfront RV park in Pacifica from protecting its coastal bluffs from erosion, which will ultimately force the business to be abandoned. The tide gauge at the city of La Jolla, California, is one of the tide gauges used by the Commission's report. Based on predicted effects from rising CO2, they warned that sea level will rise at a rate of 5.1 millimeters per year by 2030 and by 9.6 millimeters per year by 2050, meaning that sea level must accelerate 2.5 to 4.5 times the current rate of relative sea level rise. In contrast, I urge you all to follow the science, because the science reveals that they are either ignorant of sea level science or just liars. Now, this includes the Department of Defense. In October 2021, the DoD released its climate risk analysis that was mandated by President Biden's January executive order. Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, who has no background in climate science, has been reduced to a climate crisis mouthpiece, writing, "To keep the nation secure, we must tackle the existential threat of climate change." But as demonstrated in the previous video, the DoD risk analysis was pure propaganda, adding absolutely nothing to what the military has already been doing to protect Americans from extreme weather for the past 100 years. Kathleen Hicks, the new Undersecretary to Defense, was given the mission to promote the DoD's climate analysis, and in her national public radio interview, although apparently she's ignorant of all the published sea level science, she warned Pacific Island nations are now in an existential crisis and they may go underwater. National Public Radio has also become the sock puppet for the climate crisis agenda. Their mission is to mindlessly state, ad nauseum, that every bad weather event, every problem was made worse by climate change. As expected during COP26, they broadcast a piece stating rising seas are putting beachfront communities and public transportation in danger due to climate change. Now, NPR's California report just dishonestly attributed beach erosion to climate change without any further investigation, stating Amtrak had to suspend service in Southern California from Orange to San Diego counties for a few weeks to make emergency repairs for, you guessed it, due to climate change. So let's do good science and investigate this further. Now, here is a map from the PSMSL, the Permanent Service of Mean Sea Level. It shows the location of the La Jolla tide gauge just north of the San Diego along the Amtrak route. NOAA's website, using data from PSMSL, shows relative sea level at La Jolla has risen just 2.13 millimeters per year. But eyeballing the graph, the rate of rise appears to have slowed down in the last 40 years. A similar relative trend and slowdown is observed up the coast at San Francisco's tide gauge. Furthermore, scientific evidence reveals that the absolute sea level rise, that's the rise due to expanding ocean water from climate change, is only 0.15 millimeters per year, suggesting due to climate change, sea level would only rise by 1 inch in 160 years. First, to determine if sea level was indeed slowing down, I downloaded the monthly data from PSMSL website onto an Excel spreadsheet. Similar to NOAA, I calculated a relative sea level rise of 2.14 millimeters per year from 1925 to 2021. Now, I recommend everyone visit the PSMSL site to retrieve such data, so you too can follow the science and evaluate the media's sea level narratives. I then graphed the same data, but with a starting date of 1980. And indeed, in contrast to climate change predictions of accelerated sea level rise, the rate had indeed slowed to 1.85 millimeters per year. And furthermore, all the fearful narratives have ignored subsidence effects, and due to ignorance or dishonesty, have failed to present the public with the rate of absolute sea level rise. Now, to determine climate effects, only the absolute rate of rise, not the relative tide gauge rate, is relevant. Thus, to find the absolute rate of rise, any vertical land motion around the tide gauge must be accounted for. Otherwise, wherever the land is sinking or subsiding, relative sea level will be exaggerated and then falsely attributed to greenhouse warming by the media. The advent of the satellite era and the global positioning systems has been a game changer for sea level science. GPS systems will allow the absolute sea level to be robustly determined. Unfortunately, there's still many tide gauges that lack co-located GPS systems or adequate long-term data. But best estimates will be determined, and some are now available from the sonel.org website that you should also visit. A GPS site near the La Jolla tide gauge has been active since 2007 and has detected a rate of sinking land of 1.7 millimeters per year. To calculate absolute rate of sea level rise, we subtract that rate of subsidence from the tide gauge rate, and the absolute rate of rise computes to just 0.15 millimeters per year. That's the rise due to climate change, or 1 inch in 169 years. It is thus dishonest or simply bad journalism for NPR to suggest the threat to Amtrak from beach erosion was due to rising CO2. Now, other scientists are doing similar calculations as I have done here for La Jolla. Beretti published a 2020 peer-reviewed paper examining 5 long-term tide gauges with 100-plus years of data in Oceania, 2 from Australia, 2 from New Zealand, and 1 from Hawaii. The blue bars represent the relative sea level rise measured by tide gauges. That average was 1.1 millimeters per year. The orange bars represent the rate of subsidence. The gray bars represent sea level's absolute rate by subtracting subsidence rates from the tide gauge rates. The average absolute rate of rise was just 0.125 millimeters per year, a hair lower than the 0.15 rate at La Jolla. The absolute sea level rise here suggests climate change requires 200 years to add just 1 inch to sea level. At COP26, Simon Coffey, representing the island nation of Tuvalu, made a very unusual internet presentation that got much media coverage. Here, the red circle represents the location of Tuvalu, east of Papua New Guinea. Coffey gave his speech knee-deep in water to hype Tuvalu's perceived threat from climate change. However, Vijay Jayaraj, A researcher with the CO2 Coalition pointed out in an article that these climate change conferences have a history of false imagery to generate fear. So, who should we believe, Simon or VJ? Well, both history and science supports VJ. The National Tidal Facility of Australia, which is now part of the Bureau of Meteorology, had reported around Tuvalu between 1978 and 1999 there was no evidence of sea level rise acceleration. In Beretti 2020, the threats to Tuvalu were specifically examined, and he concluded absolute sea level rise on Tuvalu was just 0.16 millimeters per year, or 1 inch in 158 years. Again, very similar to La Jolla and the 5 oceanic stations. Furthermore, researchers examining photographs and satellite imagery of Tuvalu's islands investigated how much of the islands were eroding away. They found that the majority of islands have grown larger and that no islands had been lost. They calculated a net increase of 7.3% in island area. In 2009, the politicians from the Maldives tried similar theatrics to encourage United Nations members to fund their island nation's development. The Maldives are located in the Indian Ocean, as indicated here by the circle. The Maldives, Ibrahim Didi, signed climate change documents while underwater in scuba gear. But now, instead of abandoning the islands to climate change, they are building artificially low elevation islands to accommodate more tourists and expanding populations. Ignorant climate crisis believers try to shame people into accepting their political agenda, arguing the world's climate crisis is due to greedy people, especially those who resist their solutions for a happy Earth. You are greedy for using coal and oil to stay warm in the winter. You are greedy for driving gasoline-powered cars and trucks. You are greedy for eating beef and supporting methane-laden cow farts. And it is you who are threatening coastal towns with sea level rise, even though absolute sea level rise is only 1 inch every 150 years. So beware. Politicians are trying to guilt-trip you with misleading information to justify why you must accept any discomforts that their agenda to deny you the use of fossil fuels. Now up next, I'm going to debunk climate crisis analyses of floods and droughts. But until then, embrace renowned scientist Thomas Huxley's advice that skepticism is the highest of duties and blind faith the one unpardonable sin. And if you appreciate the science clearly presented here, science rarely presented by mainstream media, then please give it a like, give it a share, or copy the video's URL and email it to friends. Subscribe to my channel to see all videos easily, or read my book, Landscapes and Cycles, An Environmentalist Journey to Climate Skepticism. Thank you.